In the early 1980s, the Soviet Union was performing well, having just conquered Afghanistan and conducted a large-scale military exercise codenamed Zapad 81. The Soviet Army's powerful mechanized corps and tank floods shocked the West. However, the Soviet Union faced difficulties that shook many insiders' faith in the system. Compared to American and European households enjoying abundant supplies, Soviet shoddily made appliances became the butt of jokes. For example, Soviet televisions were seen as hidden bombs, liable to explode at any moment. In Western narratives, Eastern European communist regimes first lost power, followed by the Soviet Union plunging into a severe crisis under Gorbachev's new thinking. Soviet republics, especially the Baltic states, began demanding independence. Gorbachev believed that by laying down arms and embracing the West with an olive branch, the Soviet Union could gain Western support and smoothly complete reforms. In fact, I have always held a highly negative view of the Soviet Union, as its existence posed a serious security threat not only to Europe but also to China. However, if I were Russian, I would struggle to understand Gorbachev's reform goals. His ability to sip coffee with Western leaders and bask in their praise stemmed not from his self-proclaimed new thinking, but from leading a superpower that terrified the West. Russia instilled fear in the West, not because of Gorbachev's lofty rhetoric, but due to its vast nuclear arsenal and Eastern European vassal states ready to launch ground attacks on Europe. Without these, Gorbachev would not even have the clout to call Reagan. Online discussions of the Soviet collapse often adopt Western narratives, claiming Soviet life was unsustainable and ordinary citizens endured poor living standards. In reality, Soviets merely perceived their quality of life as inferior to the West's, far from dire or even undignified. I was young when the Soviet Union collapsed, but my hazy memories are filled with hunger and a longing for meat that modern people can hardly imagine. As for Soviet televisions potentially exploding, let me say that in China at the time, a family owning a TV drew the entire village to watch. Every evening, we gathered around the village chief's TV to watch Hong Kong dramas, with someone assigned to maintain order. As for cars, I first saw one after entering the county town. Thus, the claim that the Soviet Union collapsed due to economic crisis is a Western deception. In fact, Russian misery began after the Soviet collapse, when, in the Yeltsin era, they faced double exploitation by Western capital and domestic financial oligarchs, deeply yearning for the stability of Soviet times. I personally aspire to universal values and have no interest in Marxism, a doctrine created by a man who could not liberate himself, whose children starved, yet devised a plan to liberate humanity, causing tragedies worldwide no less catastrophic than those of Hitler and other fascists. Unfortunately, I was born in a country that touts Marxism. Fortunately, in my era, China paid lip service to Marxism but embraced market economics in practice. Under Deng Xiaoping's policy that it matters not whether a cat is black or white as long as it catches mice, China began comprehensively learning from the US and the West, swiftly escaping poverty within decades to become a global economic powerhouse. In my hometown, a fifth-tier Chinese city with GDP at the national average, most families own cars, supplemented by electric bicycles and other transport options. Every household has a clean apartment. Modern appliances are widespread. Urban infrastructure is robust, and schools and hospitals are respectable. Today's children have no concept of hunger. Eating at KFC in a big city was a boast-worthy event for years in my childhood. But now, readily available KFC and other Western fast food are seen as junk, far less appealing to kids. More importantly, China transformed from a backward agrarian nation into the world's most powerful industrial state, a superpower on par with the US. In contrast, Russians, despite possessing the world's vastest territory and abundant resources, fell from global superpower to a nation mired in war, blockaded by the US and Europe. The severe crisis was sparked by Ukraine, once directly ruled by Russia. Indeed, Gorbachev believed American lies that unifying Germany, withdrawing from Germany, and even exiting Eastern Europe would make the West drop its hostility toward the Soviet Union. But after Eastern European states broke free, the West turned its gaze to Soviet territory, starting with the Baltic states. Soviet republics declared independence one by one, and Russia, driven by Yeltsin's personal ambitions, abandoned defending Soviet unity. After the Soviet collapse, Russia received Western promises that NATO would not expand eastward. Yet NATO never stopped expanding, and by the time Putin took power, the West openly denied any signed agreement barring NATO expansion. Russia naively thought it could join NATO and integrate into Europe. Though a win-win for Europe and Russia, the US, intent on controlling Europe, would never allow it. Moreover, after the Soviet collapse, the US and Western nations orchestrated color revolutions in Ukraine, Belarus, and Central Asian states, toppling regimes, inciting ethnic divisions, pitting local majorities against Russians, and escalating tensions, with Ukraine as a prime example. As a former Soviet industrial hub and agricultural base, Ukraine enjoyed decent living standards, with fertile land and numerous industrial cities. Even China, a global manufacturing powerhouse, sought to buy motor sich from Ukraine, underscoring its industrial prowess. Logically, without turmoil, such a nation would have a happy populace. But American intervention changed everything. When pro-Russia politicians gained power, the US and West stoked Ukrainian nationalism to overthrow governments. Pro-Western regimes then took unfriendly actions against Russians. This tug-of-war led Putin to perceive deep malice, prompting him to annex Crimea and later wage war on Ukraine, occupying several eastern regions under the pretext of protecting local Russians. The protracted Ukraine war has brought severe calamity to Russia and Ukraine, with both nations pouring in vast resources yearly and sacrificing countless young lives. These two peoples, long called brothers in Soviet times, saw Crimea transferred from Russia to Ukraine to celebrate their friendship. Yet after the Soviet collapse, Western narratives dominated Ukrainian society, fostering deep anti-Russian malice that drove Ukrainians to frenzy. Now, Russians regret believing Western lies, having lost not only Eastern Europe and Soviet republics, but also national glory and ethnic dignity. Today's Russia, with a GDP one-tenth of China's, faces a former junior partner, once reliant on Russian weapons, now a superpower it looks up to, leaving Russians psychologically shattered. In fact, without Chinese goods, Russia might have collapsed into shock after Western firms withdrew en masse, unable to sustain daily life. On May 9th, Russia's Victory Day parade, marking the 80th anniversary of the Great Patriotic War victory, showcased few new weapons. Compared to the suffocating pressure of the Soviet Red Army at its 1980s peak, it was a different league. This August, China will hold a grand parade for the 80th anniversary of its anti-Japanese war victory, offering global military enthusiasts a visual feast, with advanced weapons debuting en masse, sparking heated discussions. The biggest policy difference between China and Russia lies in this. Though both abandoned ideology, forsaking communism for capitalist market economies, China clung to nationalism, rejecting Western deceptive narratives. China never dreamed of integrating into the West, especially not like Japan or South Korea, sacrificing sovereignty for acceptance, a key lesson China learned from Russia. I hope Putin and future Russian governments realize how dangerous it is to fantasize about Western goodwill. Facing Trump's overtures now, they must decide cautiously.